Mark's Gospel opens up with a reference to Malachi 3 and Isaiah 40.
Well, you're close, but you're missing that the Greek of the first part of the Malachi quotation is actually closer to the Septuagint version of Exodus 23:20 than it is to the Septuagint version of Malachi 3.
What's strange about this response is it presents this as some sort of obstacle what Jacob is saying, as if somehow the citation of Exodus 23 is mutually exclusive with any sort of allusion to Malachi 3. As Markan scholar Ricky Watts notes, traditionally Malachi 3 verse 1 is rightly regarded as the primary source because it is a closer reworking of the Exodus text, and he's citing the SBL commentary by Beth Glazer McDonald. In other words, it's clear that Mark is conflating several texts at the beginning of his gospel. He quotes Exodus 23 verse 20, he quotes Isaiah 40 verse 3, and Malachi 3 verse 1, and as Watts notes, this is consistent with a typical first century exegetically modified conflation, and as such, both Exodus and Malachi are in view, with the latter providing the center of gravity.
And in Exodus 23:20, we have God talking about how the angel has authority over the forgiveness of sins because God's name is in him.
Now notice that Dan wants to use this to set Jesus up as the divine agent, but then he also goes on to say that the way Mark is using it is specifically referring to John the Baptist as the messenger.
Now, in this part of Mark, the angel is John the Baptist.
So this begs the question, why does Mark use this conflation of these three citations to introduce his gospel? Well, he uses Exodus 23 verse 20 because it's the first Exodus, meaning it's the pattern of God's redemption. And so Mark wants to call that to mind. The second quote from Isaiah is a prophecy of a second Exodus, where a messenger will go before God before the day of his second Exodus or salvation, which leaves us wondering why Malachi 3 verse 1. Well, the nuance that this verse brings is not only does it introduce a messenger, just like Exodus 23 and Isaiah 40, but after the messenger, God himself promises to arrive and judge Israel's temple. And the reason that is significant is because these combined prophecies introduce John as the messenger and then set up the expectation that God's going to come next and judge his temple. But instead of God arriving in Mark's gospel, Jesus arrives. And what does he do? Well, one of the primary points of conflict in Mark's gospel is he marches into the Jerusalem temple and he judges it. He prophesies over it. He does exactly what Malachi 3 said God would do after his messenger comes.
However, as we're going to see, the identities of the people being referred to by these different quotations is intentionally ambiguous, precisely to create a situation where you're conflating and also distinguishing identities for the sake of the author's rhetorical goals related to Christology, which are more about ambiguity than clarity.
What's strange about this is that suddenly the identity of Jesus is ambiguous in Mark, whereas in his earlier video, Dan says that the Christology of Mark is very clear, and in fact there is no statement about Jesus being God.
The story only occurs in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, which absolutely don't represent Jesus as God.
I'm confused by whether or not Mark is being clear or unclear, but I think Mark is very clear. For example, the first verse in the Gospel of Mark is said to be not only the title, but the structure of the book. And you'll notice Jesus is introduced to be the Messiah and to be the Son of God. And there's a very careful structure in the Gospel of Mark. Right in the center of Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 8, it's confessed that Jesus is the Messiah. And by the very end in Mark 15, it is recognized that Jesus is the Son of God. Mark is being very deliberate with his Christology.
Yes, the Hebrew of Isaiah 40 uses the Tetragrammaton Adonai. The author of Mark does not, because they're reading the Septuagint, they're quoting the Septuagint. And in the Greek, the word is just Kyrios, which just means Lord, which can be used as a substitution for the Tetragrammaton, but can also be used to refer to other individuals who can bear the title Lord, but are not Adonai, the God of Israel.
Which is exactly who Malachi promises is going to arrive. Malachi 3 verse 1, Yahweh says he's going to send his messenger, which will prepare the way for his arrival. That is, then Adon will come, a variant of Adonai. Now some would say that's only referring to a human master, but here God seems to be applying this to himself, because then in verse 2, after the close of this quote, it's Yahweh who's speaking, saying he's going to arrive and that Israel will meet their Lord. Mark then takes up this quote along with Exodus 23 and Isaiah 40 to say, hey, the messenger has arrived, and who are we to expect next? Well, we're to expect Adonai, the Kyrios of Israel. Mark is saying that's exactly who came. Interestingly, the only characters that Kyrios is used to refer to in Mark's gospel are Yahweh and Jesus, and I think that's pretty significant.